Welcome back. You're still watching Network Africa on Channels Television. Now, you will recall that earlier this week, the human rights organization Amnesty International accused three major companies, that's Apple, Samsung, and Sony, among others, of failing to do basic checks to ensure minerals used in their products were not mined by children. In a report into cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Amnesty International found that children as young as 7 were working in dangerous conditions. Cobalt is a vital component of lithium-ion batteries, and on their part, the firms maintain that they have a zero-tolerance policy towards child labor. Well, joining us for more on these findings is Amnesty International's Mark Dummett. He is a researcher on business and human rights, and he joins us from London. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa.
Thanks a lot for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, do you care to elaborate just a bit more on what Amnesty International found out regarding these children in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Yeah, sure. Happy to explain that. We went to the Congo last year where we worked with a Congolese organization called AfriWatch, which looks at how raw materials from Central Africa are mined and then traded internationally. So with our Congolese friends and colleagues, we investigated conditions in these cobalt mines, which, as you said, ends up in everybody's mobile phones and also laptops and tablets and other electronic devices. And we found that in many cases, a lot of this cobalt is mined in terrible conditions, in some cases by thousands of children, in other cases by adults who work in very, very dangerous mines where accidents are frequent.
Well, Mark, what kind of response have you received since you made your findings public?
Well, we wrote to all of the companies that we named in our report. We wrote to 26 different companies, so those ones you mentioned, Apple, Samsung, Sony, also Microsoft, Lenovo, and car makers as well, Daimler and VW, because this cobalt also goes into the batteries in hybrid and electric cars as well. We received replies from most of them, and none of them were able to explain to us that they had systems in place to track the cobalt. They basically said that it was too difficult for them to identify where the cobalt comes from because their supply chains are so complicated. But our response to them is that if we, a charity, a non-profit organization, can do that kind of research, then some of these companies, which are some of the richest in the world, I mean, Apple made profits of $49 billion last year. You know, if we can do it, they should be able to do it.
That's certainly an important point. Now, Mark, what kind of consequences are we possibly looking at if these allegations in your findings are proven to be true?
Well, you know, one of the things is that, you know, in the DRC, like Nigeria, in fact, like pretty much every country in the world, this kind of hard labor by children is illegal. So what we're looking at is illegal action, illegal behavior taking place. These mines are illegal. You know, there's no way that children as young as 7 should be doing this difficult and dangerous work. So as well as the companies, there's also a responsibility for the Congolese authorities to do something about it, to take the children out of the mines and send them to school.
What about the companies, those big names that we mentioned earlier on? What kind of consequences are we looking at for them in the event that everything in your findings are proven to be true?
Well, what we don't want them to do is to stop buying cobalt from the DRC, because the people there rely on this valuable mineral. What we want them to do is to become part of the solution. I mean, if I can just draw a parallel with your country, with Nigeria, you know, look what's happening in the Niger Delta and with Shell.
Yeah.
We don't want Shell to pull out of the Niger Delta before it's helped clean up all that oil pollution. So in the same way, you know, if Apple and these other companies have been profiting from child labor in any way, well, then they should be part of the solution, working with the Congolese government and maybe the UN and others to try and to help these very, very poor families whose children are sent out to work.
Now, just before I let you go, Mark, is there a way to enforce what you're looking at as, you know, being part of a solution? Because you're a non-profit organization, and that's understood, but is there a way to enforce what you're looking at accomplishing?
Well, we would like, the governments in the countries where these big tech firms are based, the US, Japan, China, Germany, etc., to have laws in place obliging these companies to respect human rights, to ensure that there are no human rights abuses at any stage in their supply chains. But what you see time and time again is that these rich corporations based in Western countries or based in Asia, say that the supply chains are too complicated and they can't be held responsible for what's happening, for example, in Africa. But we say, the world is small, and it doesn't matter whether the victim is an African or a European or an American or a Chinese. We're all people, and therefore these corporations should do everything they can to ensure there are no human rights violations.
Well said. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa. We appreciate your time and look forward to having you join us again. Thank you very much. Amnesty International's Mark Dummett. He is a researcher and on business and human rights, speaking with us from London. Now, international prosecutors accuse a former Lord's Resistance Army commander of abducting children to be raped, enslaved, or trained as soldiers in its long campaign against the Ugandan government. Dominic Ongwen is living proof of the adverse effects of recruiting child soldiers, as he is also a victim of kidnap and also a former child soldier who rose through the ranks of Joseph Kony's rebel group, who also faced accusations of slaughtering civilians among 70 charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. Today's confirmation of charges hearing is a test of prosecutors who need to convince judges that their case, which was hastily reinvestigated since Ongwen's surrender last January after years on the run, is strong enough to merit a full trial on the facts. Now, what you're seeing on your screen is actually some of the charges that have been leveled against Dominic Ongwen. There are 60 in number, but this is a summary of what those charges are all about. He's accused of using child soldiers, keeping sex slaves, attacking refugee camps for people who have been displaced, lynching of children in huts at Lukodi camp specifically. He's also accused of murdering 100,000 people and abducting 60,000 children. Now, it's unfortunate, but there's been a collapse in the power-sharing agreement signed last week in South Sudan, which was meant to be the culmination of peace accords to bring an end to the ethnic fighting in that new country. The fighting has killed tens of thousands and displaced more than 2 million South Sudanese, and that's according to the United Nations. For now, the focus of the United Nations is looking at how to raise $1.3 billion in humanitarian aid to help those 2 million people get back on their feet.
Hunger and malnutrition are present in locations that were previously considered stable. About 3.9 million people, according to the IPC, nearly 1 in every 3 people in South Sudan were severely food insecure as at September 2015, including, according to the IPC, which was launched by government and partners, including some 30,000 people who were facing catastrophic food insecurity. The challenge we face is unprecedented. It is the sincere hope of the humanitarian community that 2016 will bring long-lasting peace to this young and potentially great nation, and replace the desperation and devastating we've seen in 2015 with hope for a brighter future.
Eugene Owosu, UNHCR Human Rights Coordinator for South Sudan. Still to come on Network Africa, it's unfortunate, but there's hope as Nigeria ranks second on the list of top 10 countries with the highest stillbirth rates. Details in just a moment.